All right. Glad you're back. Last week we spent some time in Genesis. Look at Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. Looking at creation, looking at the fall, looking at the effects of the fall. Asking the question, are we supposed to live in the fall reality and the Genesis 3 reality and just accept it as is, or are we called to strive for the Genesis 1 reality and try to go for that? So that's what we talked about last week. I felt like it was a good discussion. And so what we're going to do tonight is going to be, we're not going to look at like one particular verse and try to break it down and talk about it. We're going to kind of do an overview of the Bible, just looking at some different women in the Bible that God used and how He used them. I always think this is a fun study to do this. I'm reading a book right now. It has nothing to do with this particular topic, but a statement that he made in this book applied to this, because he said that he was talking about how our local churches, and really he meant more the churches that we attended in our formative years as we were growing, that our local churches shape not only how we read the Bible, but shape what we read in the Bible. And I find that to be true for myself, because many of these women, they were foreign to me growing up. They were women that maybe we glossed over, read real quickly, but never took the time to actually stop and see, what are these women doing in this particular text? And some of them I wasn't even really familiar with until, a couple of years back, and I started going through this and studying and doing a little more. And I think it's important to look at these women because no individual, and we talked about this at the beginning, the very first class, no individual text in the Bible can be separated from the larger story of the Bible. No individual text in the Bible can be separated from the larger narrative. Anything that we read's got to fit with the larger story. If I don't know if this is dangerous ground to walk on or not, but a statement that I think of is, if a particular interpretation I have of a text doesn't fit with the larger story, doesn't fit with the examples that we have in the Bible, then I've got to re-examine my interpretation of that particular text. And I think that looking at these women in the Bible and then trying to fit these women and what they did and how God used them, try to fit them with some of our texts that we go to when we talk about women in the church. I think these women have an impact on how we should read these other texts. Does that make sense? And so we're going to take a step back from looking at any one particular verse, and we're just going to kind of look at some women in the Bible and look at how God used them, how they were used in Israel's history, how they were used in the church. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover every woman that's in the Bible. We're just going to kind of take some that, it's my class, so I can do this, take some that I handpicked, and look at them. And we might get through all the ones that I have listed. We might not, depending on time. So let's just jump right in. The first one that I want to look at is Miriam. Who is Miriam? Moses' sister. Moses' big sister. We're first introduced to Miriam in Exodus chapter 2. At least our best assumption is that this sister in Exodus chapter 2 is Miriam. She's not listed by name here. But we're told, the story about Moses, that, his mom put him in this basket in the river. And if you look in verse 4 of Exodus chapter 2, we find this sister that we're assuming is Miriam. This sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And again, we're assuming that's Miriam in the story because we don't know of any other sisters. We're just going to assume that's who that is. And so Exodus 2, we have Miriam right there in verse 4. She's standing there watching her baby brother go down the river. And then she doesn't pop back up again until we get to Exodus 15. Now, before we get to Exodus 15, what all has taken place between Exodus 2 and Exodus 15?
Moses was adopted
Okay, you got the adoption by Pharaoh's daughter. What else we got? What else happened?
Miriam's gotten a lot older.
She's gotten a lot older.
Everybody's gotten older.
Everybody. Okay. What? Just in general, not really thinking about Miriam herself. Just what in general? Just what's the story of what's happened so far? You got plagues, lots of them. You got burning bush. You got Moses and the slaves. You got Moses going before Pharaoh. You've got finally the Pharaoh giving in, letting Moses take all the people out, and so Moses gets all the people gathered together. They head out. Oh, you got the Passover. Forgot about that. Can't forget about that. It's a biggie, right? But after all that, he gets all the people together. They're able to leave. They start leaving. Pharaoh changes his mind, sends people after him. They go after him. We know the story. The sea parts. Israelites go through it. The Pharaoh and his people follow. The waters cave in after them. Lots of stuff have taken place between Exodus 2 and Exodus 15. And so Exodus 15, right before we get into that, we just had the story of them crossing the sea and the waters closing in on the Egyptians. And so what do we find in Exodus 15? There's two things there. There's two songs. The song of Moses and the song of Miriam. We're not really going to look at the song of Moses right now, but I do want to go down and look a little bit at what it has to say about Miriam. Miriam hasn't popped up anywhere between chapter 2 and chapter 15, and now all of a sudden she's got a song. But what I want to say is that just because she hasn't popped up anywhere in the text doesn't mean she hasn't been actively involved in the story. And we can get from Exodus 15 and even another passage in one of the prophets that she was very active in what took place. And so if you look at Exodus 15, somebody read verses 19 through 21. A little short section there.
When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. And Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her, with tambourines and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea."
All right, so looking at Exodus 15, 19 through 21, what's something we can learn about Miriam? What does it say, Miriam? She can play instruments. She can sing. She's a prophet. She's a prophet. Some translations say prophetess. Others just call her prophet. But it says in verse 20, then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, and she can dance. That's important to you, apparently, the music and the dancing.
Well, the prophet is something everybody can bring up. But who's going to think about singing and dancing and playing the tambourine?
Well, actually, throughout the Old Testament, singing and dancing and playing instruments was part of prophecy. There's some places in Chronicles and some other places where music is intimately tied to the role of the prophet, where they sing and they dance, and that's part of what prophecy is.
Actually, I think it's important in the sense there was an exuberance here.
Yeah.
It wasn't just talking. It was a lot of other stuff.
Yeah. And so what I want to look at is the fact she's called a prophet. Up until this point, there's only been two other people in the Bible that's been called a prophet. Abraham is one of them, and the other is her brother, Aaron. The only two people listed in Scripture up to this point as being a prophet, which I guess is significant, that the third person that you hear about being a prophet is Miriam. We're not entirely sure at this point in Israel's history what the role of prophet looked like. This is still early in their history, and much later in their history, We actually know that there started to become like schools of prophecy and different things like that, and kind of knew the roles that they played. But this early in their history, we're not real sure what a prophet did. But we know that from some things that have been said, that one of the things that it obviously entailed was that they spoke for God. Numbers chapter 12 has this little conversation that's going on. Actually, Aaron and Miriam are upset at Moses at this point in Numbers chapter 12. Upset because he had married this Cushite woman. And so it says in Numbers 12, verse 1, it says, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. And then they say, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken what? Through us also. And so whatever the role of prophet was at that time, it's pretty clear that God spoke through Miriam. God used Miriam as his mouthpiece. She spoke for him. He spoke through her to the people. Now, it's entirely possible that, I don't want to rule this out. It's entirely possible that at this point that her role as prophet could have been aimed specifically at the women of Israel. But we're not necessarily told that. That's just kind of an assumption. But she is a prophet, and she speaks because she's a prophet. She's someone who actually God speaks through for the people. And her name actually shows up much later in the Old Testament. It shows up in one of the prophets. It shows up in Micah. In Micah chapter 6, there's a section here where God's kind of, I don't want to say he's defending himself, but he's trying to say, here's what I've done for you up to this point. You're going to treat me this way? And as he does this, he recites the story. He kind of retells them all the things that he's done for them. And he mentions Miriam in this. It's in Micah chapter 6. Says, listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusations. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to lead you. Now, I don't really like the way the NIV reads that because it makes it sound like Aaron and Miriam are something other than Moses. It says, I believe it says something like, I sent Moses to lead you, and also, or something, also Miriam and Aaron. New American Standard, which is a much more literal translation, says just, I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The Complete Jewish Bible says, I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to lead you. And so whatever that role of prophet looked like, whatever her purpose was, it's pretty clear through the text that she was considered a prophet and she was considered a leader of Israel. Again, we talked a lot about Moses. We talked a little bit about Aaron. But I can't say that I've ever really had a whole lot of discussion about Miriam and the role that she played in all this. But it seems pretty clear from the text that she played a role. That she was a prophet very early on in Israel's history. She was a prophet and a leader.
I think it's worth noting that even though her song is really short, all the theme of her song is echoed by all the prophets. I think most clearly in Mary's song that we have in Luke, is this idea that God has brought down the mighty and is lifting up the humble. And
Yeah.
I think that through all the prophets.
Yeah, her message is is right in line with the message of the rest of the prophets. God bringing down the exalted, saving His people. So anyway, any other comments about Miriam? That was a real quick one, but I just want to look at that one. I think that's an important one because it's part of Paul's history. It's part of Jesus' history. To know that Miriam was a prophet, to know that Miriam was someone who led Israel, that she spoke, that God spoke through her. Any thoughts on Miriam? All right, well, let's move to the next one then.
It's probably worth noting that she didn't always do the right thing now.
Neither did Moses.
Sure.
Neither did Abraham.
Absolutely. But
yeah. So what?
There's an interesting aspect to this. Both Miriam and Aaron were older than Moses.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the next.
well, the parallel I think in the New Testament is she, spoke against Moses' authority.
Yeah.
And got in trouble for that. Now, Korah did the same thing.
Yeah.
But I just think, that we do have a little bit. That's the story about Miriam that
Yeah.
I think we talk about. That and her finding Moses' mother to be his nursemaid.
Of course,
Yeah.
if she hadn't been a leader, speaking against Moses would have been irrelevant.
Yeah.
The only reason one has to worry about what someone says is because of their influence
Yeah.
and leadership.
Yeah.
If they're nobody, then it means nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
And, perhaps that makes means we have a more full picture of her than we do somebody like Deborah or Joshua, who really, we don't have anything recorded that they did that was
Yeah.
not in the will of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Which we have that with a lot of prophets, right? Elijah, he's got his flaws. And, so, yeah, that's right. You brought up Deborah. That's the next one we're going to go to. I love Deborah's story. Who is Deborah? Judge. She's one of the judges. We're going to find her in Judges chapter 4. Not just thinking about Deborah, but just thinking of judges in general. What was a judge? What was the role of the judge? How did they function?
Save the people.
I'm sorry?
To save the people.
Okay. So you have to save the people. What were some other roles of the judge?
Military leaders often.
Military leaders. They were often military leaders.
There was some profit function to them as well.
That's interesting. We're going to look at that here in a minute because that's an interesting one. Because as far as I can tell, Deborah's the only one who exercised that role. I don't know for sure, but as far as I can tell, yeah, we'll look at that. The Holman Bible Dictionary, which I know is not the supreme authority, but just to give you a definition, it says that a judge in the Bible is an official with authority to administer justice by trying cases, one who holds responsibility of a judge, and a military leader or deliverer, which goes into the saving them, the deliverer aspect. Basically, judges were charismatic leaders that God used to lead Israel. Many of the judges would decide legal disputes. Many of them would dispense wisdom. Some of them would exercise judgment on the guilty. They would shepherd Israel with respect to the law. They kind of judged Israel based on the law. And they led military campaigns. And it's in that vein that we discover Deborah in Judges chapter 4. And we quickly discover that Deborah is more than just a judge. And you mentioned one of the things, but she's more than just a judge. So let's look at Deborah at Judges chapter 4. And somebody read verses 4 through 7 for me.
Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. I'm sorry, how far did you
Through verse 7. Sorry.
Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. And I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariot and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand.
Okay. So we find Deborah in Judges 4, and she is a judge, but we also find out that in addition to being a judge, she's also what in verse 4? She's a prophet. And according to verse 6, being a prophet, she spoke for the Lord. I mean, it says in verse 6, she sent for Barak, and when she got them, she spoke. She said, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. And she was speaking on behalf of God to this commander. And so she's a prophet. And as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, and if you know better, please tell me, but as far as I can tell, while some of the others may have exercised some prophetic role, she's the only one that's actually called a prophet in Judges. I couldn't find another one that was actually called a prophet in Judges. But she is a judge. She is a prophet. We learn from verse 4 that it says, Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was doing what? Leading what? Leading all of Israel. I think that's pretty important. Leading all of Israel. And then we find out that not only is she a prophet, a judge, she's leading all of Israel, but verse 5 talks about how she holds court. She sits under this palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel and the hill country, and the Israelites would go up to her and they would look for her wisdom and discernment and have their disputes decided, that she was the one who did that. And so I guess we just put that under the role of judge. I was going to write something else, but and then in addition to being a judge, in addition to being a prophet, in addition to leading all of Israel, she's also a what? What does she do with Barak? She's a military leader. He won't even go to battle unless what? Unless she, does that sound right? She won't go to battle unless she goes with them. I think that's pretty important. If you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go, I'm not going to go. I think that says something about the respect, the honor of, I don't know if it's of Deborah herself or of the position that she held. But this military commander wouldn't go out to battle unless she was willing to go with him and do it with him. I think that's that says a lot about Deborah and how Israel viewed her and her role. Now, I read somewhere recently, I was reading some different stuff based on this class and trying to get ready, and somebody made the statement that, I don't know, it was a pretty harsh statement about, I don't remember how exactly it was said. Something about, we just need to follow God's pattern from the very beginning, and God has always used men from the very beginning. Came down pretty hard on it, and somebody said, what about Deborah? And his comment back was, Deborah was an embarrassment to Israel. And I thought, you got to make some twists and some turns and some big leaps and big assumptions to come to that. Because if anything, she's celebrated. You get over into chapter 4, and you got this whole song. Chapter 5, you got this whole song of Deborah, and she's called the mother of Israel. I don't, I've heard people say that the only reason Deborah was leading because no man stepped up.
That's what I was going to say.
Where do we get that? You got to make some twists and turns in the text, and you got to make some big assumptions to come to that, because we're not told that.
She must have been tough. Her name means hornet. That's my sister's name, and it makes sense.
Hornet. That's kind of like Josh has been doing a class on Sunday mornings about the apostles, and The sons of thunder, his theory was that thunder might have been their mother. So hornet, thunder, goes along. I understand. I like it. But here's what's really interesting to me is that there are only 3 people in all the Bible that hold 3 titles: prophet, judge, and military leader. 3 people in all the Bible that are given those 3 titles.
And what's interesting also is this is probably written down. This is written down well after. But they still know that's the tree of Deborah.
Yeah.
You know, that's the place of Deborah's judgments.
Yeah.
It's still in the minds of people after she's gone.
Yeah. You take a guess on who the 3 are? Well, Deborah's one of them. Who's the 3 that are given the triple title of prophet, judge, and military leader? Moses and Samuel. That's Moses and Samuel. That's some pretty good company to keep, I would think. To list Deborah in the category of Moses and Samuel. And so again, I look at this and I go, okay, we've got to fit this larger story into how we read some other text about how God uses women or allows them to do whatever. You got Miriam, this prophet and leader. You got Deborah, this judge, prophet, leader, military commander. I think that's some pretty good stuff to look at.
And of course, she fits in with the whole story of how God acts in the world. He chooses the unexpected, the youngest, the cast out, the least likely person, the man on the run like Moses was. He was a man on the run. And to do his bidding, so it's clear that he does it and not them.
And I also think, I could be wrong about this. I'm trying to remember. I did a study on Judges a while back, and so this isn't fresh in my memory, but I was thinking that Deborah is the only judge in the whole book that never had a negative thing said about her. All the other judges had something negative said about them at some point, but Deborah's the only one that didn't, if I remember correctly.
I just can't imagine the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or the Syrians, or the Egyptians saying we won't go to war unless this woman goes with us.
She must have been a hornet.
I mean, it's just not Middle Eastern.
Yeah. No, it's not. No, it's not.
And so, so this stands out for that reason, too.
Yeah.
It's atypical.
The next one that we're going to look at is one that I was not really familiar with at all until I started doing a study like this a few years back. It's one that maybe you've heard of, and maybe you know the story a whole lot better than I do. But Huldah. Ever heard of Huldah?
Yeah.
Huldah? I mean, you haven't heard of Huldah. Okay. Yeah. See, this is going to be a good one. I like Huldah. Huldah's got some good stuff in it. Huldah shows up in 2 Kings. And don't feel bad that you haven't heard of her. I hadn't either for a long time. And again, like I said, sometimes our churches not only shape how we read the Bible, but shapes what we read in the Bible. So Huldah shows up in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 22. Before we actually read there, just a quick backstory. After the Judges, Israel entered into a period of monarchy. God had been holding out for a long time. He didn't want them to have kings. That's why they went through the Judges and all stuff, was this way of not going into having kings. Israel kept wanting to have kings so that they could be like all the other nations. God kept saying, no, that's not a good thing. You don't need that. They kept saying they wanted it. And so after the period of the Judges, God reluctantly allows Israel to go into a period of monarchy, a period of having kings. And there were some good kings, but there were also some really bad kings. And with each bad king, Israel falls farther and farther away from God, further away from their covenant with Him. And we get to 2 Kings 22, and we're introduced to a new king, a very young king, who's actually listed as one of the good guys. And what king is that?
Josiah.
Josiah. We get Josiah in 22, 2 Kings 22. One day, the high priest during Josiah's reign, Hilkiah, reports to Josiah that they have found a book that had apparently been lost. They didn't know it was there. And that book ended up being what? The Torah, the book of law. They'd lost this really important book in their history that guided them, that gave them their identity, that gave them their way of life. They'd lost it. And Hilkiah, this high priest, finds this book of the law, had been lost. He takes it, gives it to Josiah. Josiah reads this book, and when he reads it, he ends up tearing his robe into pieces, and he mourns and he cries because he knows that Israel had not been living according to this book. And so in 2 Kings 22 and verse 13, we'll start in verse 11. It says, "When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest." I'm going to skip those names. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest. "Go and inquire of the Lord." I want you to notice that phrasing. "Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all of Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us." That phrasing, "go and inquire of the Lord." Josiah wanted someone that could exegete, someone that could interpret this book of the law for them. And the way he phrases that is, "go and inquire of the Lord." When he wants somebody to exegete a text, when he wants somebody to interpret this book of the law, he called that inquiring of the Lord. The person who actually does that, the person who gives them the interpretation, who exegetes that text, is speaking for God. And so he wants somebody to teach them what this book of the law says. And he phrases it as, "I want them to go and inquire of the Lord." Now what's interesting about this is that Hilkiah the priest apparently can't do this or doesn't want to do this, which I find interesting. He's the high priest. You'd think he'd be able to do this. But he doesn't. And this is where we're introduced to Huldah. And so right after we get this, "go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all of Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger." He keeps going on. Verse 14 says, "Hilkiah the priest and these other people went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the son of Haras, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter." So when the king and the high priest wanted to have somebody exegete the text, interpret the book of the law for them, to inquire of the Lord, who do they go to? They go straight to this prophet, Huldah.
Which is also interesting because the high priest has a quasi-prophetic role already.
Yeah.
It's not just a prophet going to a prophet.
Yeah.
In some sense.
And that's why I was saying it's interesting to me that Hilkiah doesn't. Why isn't he the one doing this? He can. I guess he can.
So he wears the jewels on his chest to make decisions.
Yeah.
The dice of the time for making decisions. Was it the Thurum and the Thurum or whatever it was?
Yeah.
As part of his vestment.
So Josiah and Hilkiah, when they want to know what a text means, they want some instruction, they want some teaching, they go to this prophetess, Huldah. Now, what's really interesting about this is, if historians are correct, this is during the same time period as Jeremiah and during the same time period as Zephaniah, who were also prophets. Why not go to them? But Hilkiah didn't use them. Hilkiah went straight to this woman. When the king says, "Go and inquire of the Lord," they go to Huldah. And Huldah ends up speaking to them very strongly, using very strong language in verse 15. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." She speaks on behalf of God, telling the king and the high priest how they should run things.
She calls him a man, not a king.
Yeah, she calls him a man.
Tell that man.
She calls him a man. She doesn't even call him the king. She calls him a man. Tell that man. I think that's pretty interesting. When you think about the idea of authority, and we haven't really gotten into that yet, and we'll get into that when we get to Timothy and stuff, but when you think about this idea of authority, you have to view it in view of this larger story, this larger narrative, where I would say that someone like Huldah is exercising some authority over the king and the high priest by telling them what the text says to them and how it calls them to live. I'd say the same thing about Deborah and about Miriam. And so we know, because we're all good Bible students, we know that Josiah led this great reform. And it was based upon this female prophet's influence, based upon her authority, that Josiah led this great reform. And all the people, if you read through it, all the people, they recommit themselves to God because of what Huldah told them, the text said.
And they went looking for her.
And they went looking for her.
She didn't come in, burst in, and say, "I got a message."
Yeah.
They were looking for her.
I gotta say, I never read that story. I read about Josiah. I never read much about Huldah. And I feel like I missed out because Huldah played maybe, I won't say a bigger role than Josiah, but a pretty equal role to Josiah in this reform. If it wasn't for her being willing to speak for God and to tell them what that book said, what the book of the law said, you got to wonder where that reform would have taken place. And so far we've got Miriam, who's this prophet and leader. You've got Deborah, who's this judge and prophet and leader and military leader. And you've got Huldah, who is this prophet who helps Josiah and Judah lead this great reform and recommit themselves, have a revival of sorts, recommit themselves to the covenant and to God. So that's three women that we've looked at in the Old Testament. We could look at some others in the Old Testament. We're actually told that Isaiah's wife was also a prophet, although we don't know anything about what she did. It just says that he had a wife that was a prophet, basically. And there's some other places. I mean, obviously we could go to Esther and go to Ruth and these other places. But these are ones that we don't talk about as much, and so I wanted to talk about these and kind of show their role. Now the question is, okay, that's Old Testament. Do we have some in the New Testament? And I think we do.
And by the way, even though they're not canonical, there are other books like Judith and others who refer to women having a major role in the life of Israel.
Oh, yeah.
They're not canonical, but they are historical.
Yeah. It says something about the time and the culture. And the next one I want to look at in the New Testament, Luke chapter 2. What's happening in Luke chapter 2? Okay, Jesus has been born in Luke chapter 2. And so let's move a little past where he's been born, staying in chapter 2. It's time for them to do something with Jesus. Take him somewhere. Where? Okay, it's time to take him to the temple to be circumcised. And when they get to the temple, we discover that there are two people at the temple who have been waiting for this particular day. And who are those two people that we come across? Simeon and Anna. Simeon is in Luke 2:25 through 35. We're not going to read that, but if you want to, you can. That's where that is found. And then we actually find Anna in verses 36 through 38. Somebody want to read 36 through 38 for me?
There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you. So we have Anna, and the very first thing that we know about Anna is what? She's also called a prophet.
She's old.
What are we calling old? What are we calling old here, Rick?
Oh, that's right. You're right. She's not old.
She had exceeded the mean age of her
She's in the
population.
middle age. She's at the height of her powers. Anyway.
She's at the height of her powers. That's right. She's at the height of her powers.
I'm ashamed that I said that.
Well,
You should be ashamed.
Actually, that's true. In their culture, age enhanced one's status.
Yeah.
It didn't diminish it
Yeah.
in our youth culture.
Yeah, it's true. The elderly were looked upon more highly than. So we know from this text that Anna was a prophet, and because we have encountered other prophets, we know that to be a prophet means that you hear from God and you speak for God. That God speaks through you, and here's Anna, who has that role, and she's at the temple, and we're told that she's at this temple and that she never leaves, that she's there, she's fasting, and she's praying, and she's worshiping all the time, night and day, she's doing that. The part that I find interesting about Anna, and the part that I find telling, that I think applies to kind of what we've been talking about, is when Jesus is actually in there and she sees them coming. In verse 38, it says, coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God, and then what does it say?
Spoke about the child to all who are looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem.
She spoke about the child to all who were there, who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. What does it sound like she was doing?
A little teaching on the side there.
Sounds like she was doing some teaching or some preaching, does it not?
It was unsolicited.
It was unsolicited preaching. Did I say project? Oh, wait. I don't know where that came from. She was a project.
Well, the implications.
How many saw that and didn't say anything?
By the way, since it's in the text without criticism, we can assume that God is active in this process.
Yeah, that God's active in this.
That she's somehow speaking prophetically, talking about what the child's going to be, even though she's just seen a baby, is all she's seen.
Yeah.
But God is apparently revealing something to her.
Apparently, she revealed something to her. She wouldn't be speaking to all these people about this coming redemption that is found in this baby boy that's just been brought in here. Let's be perfectly honest. Greek has a variety of different words that can be used to describe someone who is speaking. This particular word here can mean just that. It can mean just to speak. But a lot of times when this word is used, it's used of someone who is speaking about God in some prophetic role, in some teaching way. Just like in Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2 and verse 2, starting verse 1, it says, "A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them." That "preached the word" is the same exact word that's used for Anna when she says that she was speaking to all these people about the coming redemption that they've been waiting for. In Acts 16, there's a text there. Acts 16, verse 32. Starting verse 31, it says, "They replied, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household.'" This is when he's talking to the jailer and his family. "You and your household." And then verse 32 says, "Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him, and to all the others in his house." That "spoke the word of the Lord" is the same thing that's being used for Anna in the temple. When all these people were gathered there, and they've all been sitting there in the temple waiting for the coming redemption, and she sees this baby boy, she decides to take this opportunity to speak to everybody in the temple that's been there waiting for this redemption, to speak about this boy and the hope that they have. It sounds like she's proclaiming something, that she's proclaiming some kind of truth. It seems like just for me, the likeliest understanding of what Anna's doing is that she's preaching there. I mean, she's sharing a prophetic message about the coming of their redemption. That the baby has arrived. This signals that what we've been waiting for is here. And she's pointing to him, just like who else pointed to Jesus? John the Baptist.
Well, why mention that she's a prophet if you're not going to assume that what she says is a prophetic oracle?
Yeah.
True. Why mention it?
So, I think Anna's an important one to look at. She's not a project. She's a prophet. A prophet in the prime of her life, at the peak of her powers, right, Rick?
Right.
And then, so that's Anna. Another one that we can't elaborate on very much because there's not much to elaborate on, but it's there and you have to kind of accept it, and that is, remember in Acts 21 when Paul goes to make a visit to Philip? What do we know about Philip? He had daughters that were prophets in Acts 21. Paul was always reliant upon others for their hospitality, for lodging. And so in 21, let's see, where am I at? I lost it. Okay, they left. It says in verse 7, we continued on our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we were greeted by the believers, and we stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea. We stayed at the house of Philip, the evangelist, one of the 7. And verse 9 says, he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Now, again, we can't elaborate too much on that because we don't have much to elaborate on other than that we have to acknowledge that it's there.
Except that since this is a Christian community.
Yeah, now the church is in.
It's the gift of prophecy.
Yeah. Now the church has been established. It's easy to look at the other ones and say, well, the church hadn't been established then. Well, by this point, you've got the church is in existence now.
And this is a spiritual gift of prophecy.
It's a spiritual gift of prophecy. It's, the Spirit has come upon. It's a fulfillment of Acts chapter 2. When Peter is, given this sermon, and he quotes Joel, and Joel says, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all the people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. And your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. The fact that Philip has 4 unmarried daughters who are prophets seems to be a fulfillment of what Peter says there with Joel.
And notice he wasn't asking permission to let the daughters prophesy.
We don't have much. We don't even have what they said anyway.
He wasn't even asking what sons and daughters that they were going to prophesy. That they didn't get a choice in it. They were going to prophesy.
Yeah.
It was God's choice, not their choice.
I have one more that I'm hoping we have time for. I tagged this one on at the very end. Not sure if I'd have time or not. This is Romans 16 and verse 1 and 2. Who do we come across in Romans 16 verses 1 and 2? I didn't actually leave a spot on our notes for this one, so you can fill it in somewhere else. But we come across who? Phoebe. Phoebe in Romans 16, 1 and 2. Romans 16 is this long list of all these people he wants to greet. And when we get in verse 1, it says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Depending on what translation you have, a servant, a deacon, a diakonon of the church in Cenchrea. And I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help that she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including myself. He starts with, I want to commend to you our sister Phoebe. Now, most scholars believe that Phoebe, and I haven't really found a scholar that hasn't said this, most people believe that Phoebe was the one who actually delivered the letter. And that's why Paul says, I want to commend her to you. She's the one who brought this letter. Somebody wrote a very important letter. They have, a lot of honor and authority to their name, but they're not the one bringing it. Then there needs to be some kind of, I give my seal of approval to this person who's giving you this letter. And so he commends to them Phoebe, probably because Phoebe's the one who brought the letter to the church there in Rome. Now, Phoebe is called, just to stay with the Greek, is called a diakonon of the church in Cenchrea. And as you know, there's lots of different ways, well, not lots, there's a couple of different ways to translate that. Your Bibles will probably say servant, and then have a footnote that'll take you down the bottom, and at the bottom it may say a deacon. Or your Bibles will say deacon, and then it'll have a footnote, and it'll tell you at the bottom that it's servant.
It's all right because all deacons are servants.
All deacons are servants anyway. And so you'll have that. And so here's the deal with this and how I read this. The Greek language, and you probably know this already, in the Greek language, one word can mean many different things. At the same time, many different words can mean one thing. Does that make sense? And there are multiple words, and it's often difficult to know when the word has so many different meanings. It's often difficult to know without good context to know what meaning is intended by this particular word, which is why there's so many questions about this and some other text. But at the same time, there are multiple words. Diakonon can mean servant and it can mean deacon, but there's other words that can also mean servant. There's other words that can also mean a worker or a laborer.
You're saying he could have used a different word if
he could have used a different word if you want to, and guess what? He did for everybody else in the text. And that's kind of where I'm going with that. He talks about others in Romans 16 that were co-laborers, co-servants with him, who worked very hard in the Lord with him, who worked very hard in the Lord for others. All through Romans 16, he talks about these other people that served, that worked hard, that labored. But he didn't use diakonon for any of them. He only used it for one person. That was Phoebe. He used the other words that mean serve, work, labor for all the other people. And I find that interesting because that tells me that he's trying to say something different about Phoebe from the other people. Now, exactly what he's trying to say, I'm not going to have my opinions, but I do think he's trying to say something very different about her than the others by using a totally different word than he uses for everybody else in that text. Another thing that I find interesting is that where am I at? Let's see. People in the Bible that Paul commends as being servants, most often they are called servants of Christ, servants of the Lord, servants of the Savior, servants of Jesus. Philippians 1:1, Timothy is a servant of Christ. Colossians 1 and verse 7, Epaphras is a faithful servant of Christ. Colossians 4 and verse 7, Tychicus is a faithful servant of the Lord. Those are very general. But Phoebe's is very specific. It's not a general, she's a good servant of Christ. The text says she is a servant of what? Of a very specific church.
And when she comes, she's going to have specific demands that she needs to make upon you.
Yeah, she's going to need help from you. She's got things she's going to request of you.
She's got a mission to complete, and they're supposed to support her. It says, help her in whatever she may require from you.
So it seems like, I'm not writing anymore. It seems like Paul is saying something specific about Phoebe. Because usually when he calls somebody a servant, he doesn't call them a servant of the church they're affiliated with. He calls them a servant in general of Christ. But for Phoebe, she's very specific to a church. She is a servant of this particular church. And we don't talk that way usually unless that implies some kind of role. Usually you're a member of the household. You're a member of the church. You're a brother or sister in the church. Those different things. But very rarely do we call somebody a servant of a church, of a particular church, unless that designates them as having some kind of role.
Also on top of that, the word benefactor is a benefactor. That's the word patron.
Yeah.
And in the Greco-Roman world, a patron was a person of high status and importance.
Most people think that she probably bankrolled Paul's ministry. Just like Jesus And Luke had women that followed him around, and it said that these women supported his ministry out of their own pockets. They bankrolled his ministry. Most people think that Phoebe, being this benefactor, this prostasis, was a woman of high standing who probably was some kind of, if you want to use modern language, a financial manager, advisor for Paul, who helped him in his ministry. Another thing that I find really neat about the language here is that Greek has a way of applying words, either masculine or feminine, depending on who they're talking about. And there is a way to talk about a woman serving and using a Greek word that has a feminine ending to it. But here, the language diakonon is a masculine word. And usually whenever a masculine word is used, it's usually used to designate a title. And he didn't do that for her. There's also, I'm trying to rush through this, there's also about 111, 113, between 111 and 113 AD, which, if you think about it, is, maybe a decade or so after John had passed, maybe, if historians are correct on how long he lived and everything. We have some letters that were being passed between Pliny the Younger, who was a governor of Bithynia, and he was writing letters to Trajan, who was the emperor at the time, and they were writing these letters back and forth, and Pliny was talking about the Christians that he'd been persecuting, because by this point, Romans were heavily persecuting the church. And in one of the letters that Pliny writes to Trajan, he speaks of 2 female Christians that called themselves deacons of the church. They called themselves, in the Latin it was ministrea, administrator of the church, a deacon. Again, this is only like a decade after John passed. And we already have in historical documents evidence that churches had women who, I don't have Phoebe up there, churches who had women who played this role that Phoebe had, being some kind of deacon. Now, what that deacon, we kind of have deacons that are over certain areas. We're not sure what a deacon was over in the Bible, but they had that role, and even right there close to when John had passed, there's talk in the church about women who were calling themselves deacons. Origen is an early church scholar who lived about between 185 and 253 AD, and he wrote what we believe to be the earliest commentary on Romans. And in that commentary, he talks about Phoebe holding this office of deacon, and that it was, I forget exactly the language that he used, but it had something to do with being given authority to take on this role within the church at Cenchrea of deacon. I can't remember exactly how he used it. But I think those are interesting because they're so close to the early church. They're so close to the primitive church.
Well, back to Pliny, when you're trying to destroy an evolving movement and you're going after people to stop it, you usually pick the leaders.
Yeah.
So you don't go for the riffraff.
Yeah, you go for those who are leading.
The people who are visible and active and have a voice in the community.
Yeah.
You don't kill them.
So they don't go for the riffraff. Rick, you're safe. You're safe. Another cool thing, and I'm not real sure where this is dated. Some people think 3rd, maybe early 4th century. But they actually found, it's called a stela. It's like a wooden plaque sort of thing. They found this wooden plaque actually on the Mount of Olives. And on it, there's this inscription that says, let's see, I'm just going to write it because it's in, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. It says, Sophia Now, I don't know exactly what it says, but I know that it translates as Sophia, the deacon, the second Phoebe. Sophia, the deacon, the second Phoebe. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean she came right after Phoebe. To be called the second of something is a title of honor. You are in the line of this particular person. So whoever this Sophia was seen as someone who followed in the footsteps of Phoebe, who carried on her ministry, so to speak. I think it's pretty interesting. Then you get to, if you want to get in our own history, Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, Walter Scott. Alexander Campbell has his own translation of a Bible, which I have in my office, translation of the New Testament, and he calls Phoebe a deacon. And he talks about in a book that he wrote called Church Organization, which is about 1853. He said, the primitive church had deacons, such was Phoebe of Cenchrea. And so, I look at Romans 16, and Romans 16, while looking at Phoebe and this role of deacon, might not have much of an impact on the idea of, we're more specifically been kind of looking at what can women do in the public worship service of the church. So we're thinking more of like speaking type stuff. And Phoebe may not hit on that particular aspect, but it does show, if she really carried this title of deacon, it does say something about how the church used women in the early church. That we had that we had Anna, who was a prophet, that we had Philip's daughters who were prophets, that even in their history there was Huldah, Deborah, and Miriam, and we've got Phoebe, who's possibly a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. Lots of evidence, I think, there.
It's not so much how the early church used women, it's how God was using women in the early church.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a big difference between that. And so I don't think the church thought they were using women. I thought that
no, not using women, but how they were willing to allow women to serve in certain roles. Yeah. And so, the reason I do this kind of study is because we're eventually going to get into Corinthians, and we're eventually going to get into Timothy. I'm not avoiding those. We're going to get into those. But I believe you have to read those in light of all this. Those texts and whatever they're saying about silence, about usurping authority, about any of those things, whatever they're saying, has to fit into the bigger picture, has to fit into the bigger narrative of the way that God has used women throughout Israel's history and throughout the church's history. They can't exist by themselves. They can't exist by themselves any more than we allow. John is famous in his gospel over and over of having Jesus talk about all you got to do is believe, all you got to do is believe. But then we come back and we look at the bigger story and we go, okay, we know it's about belief, but there's also this stuff about baptism and Acts and these examples. So we know how to look at particular texts in light of the bigger story and see how they fit in. But I'm not sure that we've done it all the time with all the texts. And I think this is one of them. I think this is one where sometimes when we go to Corinth and we go to Timothy, we read those and forget about the bigger story. And I want to say that whenever we get to those, we need to read those with the bigger story in mind. Read those with the idea of, somebody said one time, do you just ignore? Do you just ignore what's being said in Timothy or whatever? And my response is, no, I don't ignore it. I read it, and I read it with authority. But I read it with the bigger picture in mind. I read it with the bigger narrative in mind, and like I said at the beginning, if the bigger story and the greater examples that are given conflicts with how I've read something, then maybe I need to re-examine how I've read something. And so I wanted to do this so that before we get into this other stuff, we have this in the back of our minds. Because I think we're gonna have to interact with those a little bit whenever we try to figure out, okay, what is Paul saying in Corinth? What is Paul saying in Timothy? And how does that fit in line with this other stuff? Thanks for being here. I held you over 10 minutes, so you all get an extra jewel in your crown.
Next week is Phil.
Phil is next week, so bring your tomatoes and be ready to toss them.